Before we begin this incredible story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss stories that will touch your heart and inspire your soul. The briefing room fell silent as Captain Marcus Chen slammed his fist on the metal table. The sound echoed through the concrete walls of the naval base like a gunshot. 20 officers sat frozen in their chairs, their eyes fixed on the SEAL team leader whose reputation preceded him like a storm. Marcus had led more successful missions than anyone in the room could count, and his word was law when it came to operations. The mission details glowed on the screen behind him. A hostage situation in a remote mountain region. 3 American aid workers trapped in a compound controlled by hostile forces. The terrain was brutal, the weather unpredictable, and the window for rescue was closing fast. Every second that ticked by meant those hostages were one moment closer to being moved or worse. Marcus turned to face the room, his jaw set in a hard line. His eyes scanned the faces of pilots, intelligence officers, and support staff. He had worked with many of them before, but this mission was different. This mission required someone special. The flying conditions would be impossible for most pilots. They needed someone who could navigate narrow mountain passes in the dark. Someone who could hold a helicopter steady in winds that would tear most aircraft apart. He spoke with the kind of authority that comes from years of combat experience. The mission would launch at dawn. They would fly low to avoid radar detection. The extraction point was on a cliff face, with barely enough room for a helicopter to hover. One mistake, and everyone would die. The pilot he chose would need nerves of steel and skills that went beyond anything taught in standard. Training Marcus looked around the room again. He knew most of these pilots. Good men, all of them. But good was not enough for this mission. He needed the best. He needed someone who had proven themselves in impossible situations. Someone who could make split-second decisions when everything went wrong. Because in his experience, something always went wrong. The silence in the room grew heavier. Officers shifted in their seats. A few pilots sat up straighter, hoping to be chosen. Others looked down, perhaps relieved they might not be selected for such a dangerous operation. Marcus let the tension build. He wanted everyone to understand the gravity of what they were about to attempt. Then he said the words that would change everything. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. He needed a combat pilot with experience in mountain rescue operations. Someone who had flown in hostile territory. Someone who had brought their crew home when all odds were against them. He did not care about rank or years of service. He only cared about one thing. Could they fly this mission and bring his team home alive? The room remained frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, from the back of the room, a chair scraped against the floor. Everyone turned to look. Standing up slowly, meeting the captain's intense gaze without flinching, was a figure that made several officers gasp. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood at attention, her flight suit pressed and perfect, her eyes steady and clear. Sarah Mitchell had known this moment would come eventually. She had spent 5 years proving herself in a world that did not always want to make room for her. Every flight had been a test. Every mission had been a chance to show that gender meant nothing. When you were 3,000 feet in the air, with lives depending on your decisions, she had flown through sandstorms in the desert, evacuated wounded soldiers under enemy fire, and navigated her helicopter through conditions that had grounded more experienced pilots. But standing up in that room took a different kind of courage. She could feel every pair of eyes on her. Some looked shocked. Others looked skeptical. A few looked angry, as if her presence was somehow an insult. She had seen those looks before, and she had learned to push past them. What mattered was not what they thought of her. What mattered was whether she could do the job. Marcus stared at her for a long moment. His face showed nothing. No surprise, no approval, no rejection. Just cold assessment. He was measuring her the way he measured every piece of equipment before a mission. Was she reliable? Would she break under pressure? Could he trust her with the lives of his men? Sarah held his gaze without blinking. She knew that showing any weakness now would disqualify her immediately. Colonel from the back row stood up and cleared his throat. His voice carried a note of concern as he addressed Marcus. He suggested that perhaps they should consider the pilots with more experience in this specific region. There were men in the room who had flown these mountains before, men who knew every wind pattern and every safe approach. His words hung in the air like a challenge, but everyone knew what he was really saying. He was questioning whether Sarah belonged there at all. Sarah felt anger rise in her chest, but she kept it off her face. She had learned that responding to doubt only made it stronger. Instead, she waited. She let her record speak for her. Marcus slowly turned to face the colonel. His voice was calm but carried an edge that made several people shift uncomfortably. He asked a simple question. Had the colonel reviewed the personnel files? Had he seen Lieutenant Mitchell's mission record? The colonel hesitated. Marcus continued without waiting for an answer. Sarah had completed 47 combat missions. She had a perfect safety record despite flying in some of the worst conditions imaginable. Last year, she had extracted a wounded SEAL team from a hot landing zone when 2 other pilots had refused to attempt it. The helicopter had taken 3 rounds of enemy fire, but she had kept it steady enough for every man to get aboard. She had brought them all home. The room seemed to absorb this information slowly. A few officers nodded, their expressions changing from doubt to respect. Others still looked uncertain. But Marcus was not done. He walked toward Sarah, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. The sound echoed in the silent room. He stopped 3 feet from her, close enough that she could see the scars on his weathered face. Close enough that she could see him searching. Her eyes for any hint of fear. He asked her directly if she could fly this mission. His voice was quiet but intense. This was not about proving a point or making history. This was about life and death. His men would be depending on her. If she had any doubt, any hesitation, now was the time to say so. No one would think less of her for stepping back. But if she took this mission, he needed to know she would see it through no matter what happened. Sarah's answer came without hesitation. Her voice was steady and clear. She could fly the mission. She had studied the terrain and weather patterns. She knew the risks, and she knew her capabilities. More than that, she understood what was at stake. Those hostages needed someone who would not quit when things got difficult. His team needed someone who would be there when they called for extraction. She was that person. The next 12 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah stood in the hangar bay, running her hands along the body of the Black Hawk helicopter that would carry them into the mountains. Every pilot had their pre-flight routine, and hers was thorough. She checked every gauge, every control surface, every system twice. Her crew chief, a veteran named Rodriguez, worked beside her without comment. He had flown with her before and trusted her completely. Marcus watched from a distance. He stood with his arms crossed, observing how she moved around the aircraft. He noticed the way she tested each control with careful precision. He saw how she discussed backup systems with Rodriguez, planning for every possible failure. He had worked with dozens of pilots over his career, and he recognized competence when he saw it. Still, a small part of him wondered if he was making the right choice. Not because she was a woman, but because this mission left no room for error. As the sun set behind the mountains, the team gathered for final briefings. Sarah sat among the SEAL operators, studying maps and satellite images. The compound where the hostages were held sat in a valley surrounded by peaks that reached over 12,000 feet. The approach would require flying through a narrow canyon in complete darkness. The extraction point was worse. A small plateau barely large enough for the helicopter's wheels, with sheer drops on 3 sides and unpredictable wind shear from the surrounding peaks. One of Marcus's men, a sergeant named Williams, leaned over to look at the maps with her. He asked questions about her approach angle and timing. Unlike some of the officers in the briefing room, Williams seemed genuinely interested in her expertise, rather than testing her. She explained her flight plan, showing him how she would use the terrain to mask their approach, and why she had chosen a specific route for extraction. Williams nodded, seeming satisfied with her answers, but not everyone was convinced. Another SEAL operator, Mitchell's opposite in every way, sat across the table with barely concealed skepticism. His name was Dawson, and he had a reputation for being difficult. He interrupted her explanation to point out that the weather forecast showed possible storms. High winds, and low visibility. He wanted to know what she would do if conditions deteriorated during the mission. His tone suggested he expected her to back out. Sarah met his challenge head-on. She pulled up weather data on her tablet and walked him through multiple scenarios. If storms hit during insertion, they would wait in a holding pattern at low altitude until they had a window. If weather closed in during extraction, she had identified 3 alternate pickup points within running distance of the primary site. And if conditions became impossible, she would make the call to abort. But her voice carried absolute certainty when she said that if there was any way to complete the mission safely, she would find it. Dawson stared at her for a moment, then gave a small nod. It was not quite approval, but it was acceptance. Marcus had been listening from his position at the head of the table. He stood and addressed the entire team. They would launch at 0400 hours. Radio silence until they reached the target area. Sarah would have complete authority over flight decisions. If she said they could not fly, they would not fly. If she said abort, they would abort. Every man in that room needed to trust her judgment, because their lives would depend on it. The meeting broke up as men moved to gather their gear. Sarah walked out into the cool night air, taking a moment to clear her head. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on her shoulders. She thought about the hostages waiting in that mountain compound. She thought about the SEAL team members who would be trusting her to bring them home. And she thought about all the people who doubted whether she belonged here. Tomorrow, one way or another, she would have her answer. Rodriguez found her staring up at the stars. He did not say anything, just stood beside her in comfortable silence. Finally, he spoke. He told her that he had been flying with pilots for 20 years. He had seen the best and the worst. And he wanted her to know that he would follow her anywhere. She was one of the good ones. Sarah smiled, grateful for his confidence. She would need every bit of support she could get in the hours ahead. The Black Hawk lifted off exactly at 0400 hours. The darkness was complete, with only a sliver of moon providing any natural light. Sarah flew using night vision goggles that turned the world into shades of green. Beside her, Rodriguez monitored instruments and communications. Behind them, Marcus and his team sat in focused silence. Each man locked into his own mental preparation for what lay ahead. The first hour of flight was relatively smooth. They stayed low, following valleys and riverbeds to avoid detection. Sarah kept the helicopter steady despite the rough terrain passing beneath them. She had flown these kinds of missions before, but never with stakes this high. Every few minutes, she checked her instruments and adjusted course based on GPS coordinates. The mountains loomed ahead, dark shapes against the slightly lighter sky. As they approached the canyon that would take them to the target area, conditions began to change. Wind buffeted the helicopter, making it shudder and dip. Sarah compensated instinctively, her hands moving on the controls with practiced precision. Rodriguez called out wind speeds and directions, giving her the information she needed to anticipate gusts before they hit. The canyon walls closed in on both sides, leaving little room for error. Marcus leaned forward from the passenger compartment. Through the headset, he asked if she was good to continue. Sarah's response was calm and professional. Conditions were challenging but within acceptable limits. They were still on schedule. She did not mention that her heart was pounding or that every muscle in her body was tense with concentration. That was not information he needed. What he needed was confidence that she had everything under control. The helicopter climbed as they followed the canyon upward. The walls seemed to press in closer, and Sarah had to make constant adjustments to keep them centered. One wrong move, and they would scrape against rock, potentially damaging the rotor or fuselage. Sweat dripped down her back despite the cold air. Rodriguez stayed silent now, knowing that she needed to focus completely on flying. The only sounds were the rotor blades cutting through the air, and the occasional crackle of radio static. Then they were through. The canyon opened into a wider valley, and Sarah could see the compound ahead. Lights glowed in the darkness, marking guard posts and buildings. She brought the helicopter down to treetop level, using the terrain to mask their approach. Marcus gave hand signals to his team, and they prepared to fast rope down once she brought them into position. Everything depended on the next few minutes. Sarah circled wide, approaching from an unexpected direction. She could see heat signatures through the sensors, showing guards patrolling the compound perimeter. The insertion point was a small clearing 200 meters from the main building. She would have to hover long enough for 12 fully equipped SEAL operators to rope down, then get clear before enemy forces could react. Her hands were steady on the controls as she began her approach. The helicopter descended into the clearing, and instantly, everything went wrong. The wash from the rotors kicked up dust and debris, reducing visibility to almost zero. At the same moment, warning lights flashed on the control panel. They were taking fire. Small arms, probably from guards who had heard them approaching. Rodriguez called out impacts, but nothing critical yet. Sarah held the helicopter rock steady, despite every instinct screaming at her to evade and climb. Marcus and his team were already on the ropes, sliding down into the darkness. She counted seconds in her head. 5 men down, 6, 7, more gunfire, and this time she felt the impact. The helicopter shuddered, but held. 10 men down, 11, 12. Marcus's voice crackled through the radio. All personnel clear. She could bug out. Sarah did not hesitate. She pulled up hard, the helicopter climbing and banking away. From the clearing, as tracers lit up the night around them, they had made it through the first phase. But the hard part was still ahead. Now they had to wait while Marcus and his team fought their way to the hostages. And when they called for extraction, Sarah would have to bring the damaged helicopter back into that valley and hold it steady while everyone got aboard. She climbed to a safe altitude and began circling in a wide pattern, checking systems and damage reports. Rodriguez was already working on evaluating what they could still do. The helicopter was hurt, but it was still flying. That was all that mattered. 30 minutes passed, then 40. Sarah maintained her holding pattern, constantly scanning instruments and the dark landscape below. Rodriguez had identified the damage from the gunfire. 2 hits to the tail section, 1 to the main fuselage. Nothing immediately critical, but the helicopter was handling differently. She could feel it in the way the controls responded. There was a slight lag when she made adjustments, a heaviness that had not been there before. Then the weather forecast proved accurate in the worst possible way. Clouds rolled in faster than predicted, thick and dark. Wind speeds increased dramatically. Sarah felt the helicopter buck and slide as gusts hit from different directions. She fought to maintain altitude and position. This was exactly what Dawson had questioned her about, and now she was living that scenario. The storm was not supposed to arrive for another 2 hours. But nature did not follow human schedules. Marcus's voice crackled through the radio, broken by static. They had the hostages. 3 civilians, weak but mobile. They were moving to the primary extraction point now, but enemy forces were pursuing them. They needed immediate pickup. He could hear the urgency in his voice beneath the professional calm. They were in trouble, and the storm was making everything worse. Sarah made her decision instantly. She turned the helicopter toward the extraction point, fighting through wind that tried to push her off course. Rodriguez called out warnings about wind shear and visibility. She already knew. She could barely see 50 meters ahead through the night vision goggles. Rain had started, making everything harder. But turning back was not an option. Marcus and his team were counting on her. The extraction point was a nightmare in good conditions. In a storm, it was nearly impossible. The small plateau was surrounded by rock faces on 3 sides, creating unpredictable wind patterns as air swirled and eddied. Sarah approached slowly, feeling her way through the turbulence. The helicopter was fighting her every second, trying to drift and spin. She made constant corrections, her entire focus narrowed to this one task. Get the helicopter over that plateau. Hold it steady. Get everyone aboard. She could see heat signatures below through the sensors. Marcus and his team in defensive positions around the 3 hostages. Movement in the trees showed enemy forces closing in. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as the SEALs returned fire. Sarah brought the helicopter lower, aiming for the center of the plateau. Winds slammed into them from the side, and the aircraft tilted dangerously. She corrected, overcorrected, then found the balance point. 50 feet from the ground, 40, 30, the helicopter settled into a hover 10 feet above the plateau. It was the best she could do. The wind was too strong and too unpredictable to land. They would have to board while she held position. Rodriguez was already at the door, helping pull people aboard. Sarah focused everything on keeping the aircraft steady. Her arms ached from the constant pressure on the controls. The damaged helicopter responded sluggishly, making every adjustment harder. Through the sensors, she could see the SEALs moving. They were loading the hostages first, lifting exhausted civilians into the helicopter. Then the operators began boarding, maintaining cover as they moved. Enemy fire intensified. Sarah heard impacts against the fuselage, but could not react. Moving now would dump everyone out. She had to hold position no matter what. Marcus's voice cut through the chaos. "All personnel aboard. Get them out of here." Sarah did not wait. She pulled up and away, the helicopter climbing through the storm. But something was wrong. The controls felt loose, unresponsive. One of those last hits must have damaged something critical. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel. Hydraulic pressure dropping. Engine temperature rising. Rodriguez's face went pale as he read the indicators. They were 15 miles from the nearest friendly base. 15 miles of mountain terrain in a storm with a dying helicopter? Sarah keyed the radio and sent a mayday call, giving their position and heading. Then she focused on flying. Every pilot knew this moment might come. The moment when everything broke, and only skill and determination stood between everyone aboard and disaster. Her training took over, moving through emergency procedures automatically. She coaxed the helicopter forward, losing altitude gradually as systems failed. The engine coughed and sputtered. Marcus appeared beside her, asking what she needed. His calm presence helped her focus. She told him to make sure everyone was secured. This was going to be rough. They might not make it to the base. They needed to prepare for a crash landing. The mountains rushed up to meet them. Sarah searched desperately for anything flat enough to set down. There a ridge with slightly less slope than the rest. It would have to do. She aimed for it, using the last of her control authority to line up the approach. The helicopter was barely responding now. Rodriguez was calling out altitude and speed. 50 feet? 40. The ridge was coming up fast. 30 feet. 20. The helicopter hit hard. The impact threw everyone forward against their restraints. Metal screamed as the landing gear collapsed. They slid sideways across rock and ice, still moving fast. Sarah pulled every emergency shutdown, trying to prevent fire. The world was a chaos of noise and motion. Then suddenly, violently, they stopped. Silence fell over the crashed helicopter, broken only by the ping of cooling metal and the howl of wind outside. Sarah's hands were still gripping the controls, her body shaking with adrenaline. Rodriguez touched her shoulder, breaking through her shock. They needed to get everyone out before fire started, or the helicopter shifted position. She nodded and began moving, her training overriding the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Marcus was already organizing the evacuation. His team moved with practiced efficiency despite injuries and exhaustion. The 3 hostages were helped out first, then the crew. Sarah was the last to leave, doing a final check to make sure no one was trapped. She stumbled out into the storm, legs barely supporting her weight. They had crashed on a rocky slope, and the helicopter was wedged between 2 large boulders. It could have been so much worse. The next hours were a blur of cold, pain, and determination. They activated emergency beacons and huddled together for warmth while waiting for rescue. Marcus sat beside Sarah, and for the first time since the mission began, he smiled. He told her that was some of the finest flying he had ever seen. She had saved all their lives twice over. Once getting them in, and again getting them out of that valley. Without her skill and courage, none of them would be having this conversation. Sarah was too exhausted to respond properly. She just nodded, letting his words sink in. Around them, the SEAL operators were checking on the hostages and tending to minor injuries. Dawson, the skeptical operator from the briefing, caught her eye. He gave her a nod of respect that meant more than any words could. She had proven herself in the only way that truly mattered. When everything went wrong, she had brought them home. Rescue helicopters arrived 90 minutes later, guided by the emergency beacons. They lifted everyone off the mountain in stages, the hostages and injured first. Sarah rode in the last helicopter, watching as the wreckage of her Black Hawk disappeared into the storm below. She had lost her aircraft, but everyone was alive. That was the only measure of success that mattered. Back at base, the reception was overwhelming. Word of the mission had spread quickly. Officers who had doubted her presence in that briefing room now stood in lines to shake her hand. The colonel, who had questioned her qualifications, personally apologized and thanked her for her service. But Sarah barely registered any of it. She was focused on making sure her crew was okay. That Rodriguez was getting medical attention for the cuts and bruises he had sustained. The hostages were reunited with their families in an emotional scene that brought tears to eyes of hardened soldiers. They had been aid workers, doctors, and teachers who had been captured while trying to help villagers in a remote area. They were alive because of the coordinated efforts of many people, but especially because one pilot had refused to give up when conditions became impossible in the weeks that followed. Sarah received commendations and recognition. There was talk of medals and promotions, but the moment that meant the most came 3 days after the mission. Marcus found her in the hangar, inspecting a new helicopter she had been assigned. He did not say much, just handed her a patch. It was a SEAL Team Trident, the symbol worn by the elite operators. She looked at him in confusion. Marcus explained that his team had voted unanimously to make her an honorary member. It was rare, almost unheard of, but they wanted her to know she was one of them. She had earned it in the hardest way possible. She had proven that courage had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with character. When the mission was on the line, she had delivered. That was all that mattered to warriors who depended on each other for survival. Sarah held the patch, feeling its weight in her hand. It represented acceptance she had fought years to achieve. But more than that, it represented something she had always known but others had needed to see. That excellence spoke louder than prejudice. That competence transcended barriers. That when lives were on the line, the only thing that mattered was whether you could do the job. She returned to flight status 2 weeks later, ready for the next mission. The questions about whether she belonged were gone, replaced by requests from teams who specifically wanted her as their pilot. She had not set out to break barriers or prove points. She had simply done her job to the best of her abilities. But in doing so, she had opened doors for others who would come after her. Years later, she trained new pilots. She would tell them about that night. Not to brag, but to teach them the most important lessons she had learned. When everyone is counting on you, when conditions are impossible, when every instinct says to quit, that is when you discover what you are truly capable of. That is when character reveals itself. And that is when ordinary people do extraordinary things, not because they are special, but because they refuse to let others down. The story of the SEAL captain who demanded a combat pilot and got Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell became legend in military circles. It was told in training schools and officer clubs, a reminder that assumptions about who can serve and how they can contribute are often proved wrong by those brave enough to stand up when called. Sarah never sought fame from that night, but she could not escape the impact of what she had accomplished. She had flown into a storm, both literal and figurative, and emerged on the other side, having changed perspectives and opened minds. That, more than any medal or commendation, was her true achievement. She had shown that courage knows no gender, that skill transcends prejudice, and that when the moment demands a hero, sometimes the hero looks nothing like what people expected. And in standing up when everyone froze, she had not just accepted a mission. She had changed what people believed was possible.